The gospel for this morning is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 14 to 30. And Jesus said to them, "The kingdom of heaven is like a man who was leaving on a trip. He called his servants and handed his possessions over to them. To one he gave 5 valuable coins, and to another he gave 2, and to another he gave 1. He gave to each servant according to that servant's ability, and then he left on his journey. After the man left, the servant who had 5 valuable coins, or in other translations, talents, took them and went to work doing business with them, and he gained 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had 2 valuable talents gained 2 more. But the servant who had received the 1 talent coin dug a hole in the ground and buried his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The one who had received 5 valuable talents came forward with 5 additional talents, and he said, 'Master, you gave me 5 valuable talents. Look, and I've gained 5 more.' And his master replied, 'Excellent, you are a good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will put you in charge of much. Come, celebrate with me.' The second servant also came forward and said, 'Master, you gave me 2 talents. Look, I've gained 2 more.' And his master replied, 'Well done. You are a good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will put you in charge of much. Come, celebrate with me.' Now the one who had received 1 valuable talent came and said, 'Master, I know that you are a hard man. You harvest grain where you haven't sown. You gather crops where you haven't spread seed. So I was afraid, and I hid my valuable talent in the ground. Here, you have what's yours.' And his master replied, 'You evil and lazy servant. You knew that I harvest grain where I haven't sown and that I gather crops where I haven't spread seed. In that case, you should have turned my money over to the bankers, so that when I returned, you could give me what belonged to me with interest. Therefore, take from him the valuable talent and give it to the one who has 10 talents. Those who have much will receive more, and they will have more than they need. But as for those who don't have much, even the little bit they have will be taken away from them. Now take the worthless servant and throw him out into the Father's darkness. People there will be weeping and grinding their teeth." Holy God, thank you for these words from the Gospel of Matthew, and bless our understanding, bless our ears and our minds and our hearts. Amen. So, Mrs. Harold left her entire estate to the church. It was just about $500,000 in 2002. Her husband had died about 8 years before she died, and she had no children, no family. The church had been her family, caring for her in those last years that she was alone and being her church family all the years before. Now, our pastor at the time, Pastor Larry, had been doing a lot of thinking at that time about the idea of using what God has given us for God's work in the world instead of hiding it away where it didn't do anyone a lot of good. I'm thinking now, thinking back on it, that maybe he had been reflecting on this very parable that we just heard. I don't remember. I really don't. It was too long ago. But let's just say when he presented his idea to the council, the MOT of the church, when he presented the idea to the council after learning of the gift that Mrs. Harold had made to the church in her will, his idea did not go over well. Well, not at first, for sure. "This is what I'm proposing," Pastor Larry said, "that we use Mrs. Harold's gift, the $500,000, for good works. instead of putting it in the endowment, untouched and unused, except for the interest that it gathers for the church's benefit. There was an uproar at the idea. You can only imagine the uproar at that idea. Well, Mrs. Harrell's good friends at the church were especially upset. What would Jenny think if she knew we were going to give away her money, the entire gift for things in the world, instead of keeping it safe in our endowment, in good investments? We, her friends, can't imagine that she would be pleased with that. Well, Pastor Larry was relentless in his suggestion that the church put the money to good use. And he eventually wore people down, basically, and he got others to agree with him. And it was finally decided that at least a big percentage of this money, this $500,000, would be used for good works. And even that was met with great consternation, a second vote, and I have to say, unfortunately, some people leaving the church. A man in the church, his name was Chester, was a conservative man. He once suggested in a Bible study that, no, he didn't, I did. I once suggested in a Bible study that Chester was in that Jesus was countercultural. Chester got really upset. And he said to me, how dare you call him countercultural? It makes me think that you're calling him a hippie, for heaven's sakes. I was kind of blown away by that. But that's what he said. And now, at that time, and I was blown away by the suggestion of Chester's. Blown away because he was so conservative in his thinking. This is what Chester suggested. Chester suggested that as many families or individuals that wanted in the church to take his challenge, he suggested they each be given $200 from Mrs. Harrell's gift. And the challenge was that each family or person who was given the $200 would grow it, would expand it, wouldn't simply just take the $200 and give it to their favorite charity, but that their challenge was to literally grow the money so that Mrs. Harrell's estate that she bequeathed to the church would grow and be an even bigger amount of money, a bigger gift to those in need. A timeline was set. I think it was probably a month. I don't remember, but it doesn't really make any difference in the details. But at the end of the time that was set, the congregation gathered together for a congregational meeting. I'm sure we had a potluck first. That's what we always did. And we heard from each member who had received the $200. Each member got to tell their story about what happened. So one family had written letters to family members and friends and neighbors outside of the church, and they asked them to contribute to the $200 with the intention that it would be then given to the work camp that the kids in the church attended, so that the work camp could afford to buy a new shed to keep all the tools that are used for their good work repairing homes. And what ended happening with that money is that it tripled. They got $600 and they gave it all to the work camp. Another family had created a raffle. I'm not too sure about the kosherness of having a raffle in the church, but they did. They created a raffle with the prize being the $200. And the amount they raised by doing this was something like $800. And they gave it to a local food pantry. One family bought $200 worth of candy bars and cookies and other items, and they went around selling them to their neighbors, and they made $300 in the process. And still another individual worked for a company that offered matching donations for employees who donated to a charity. So their $200 to the Humane Society in the town became $400. And it went on and on. And Mrs. Harrell's money grew a lot. I can't think of a better story to share with you than that one today. Today's parable of the talents is another difficult parable. We've been hearing some difficult parables lately. The bridesmaids who got left out of the wedding feast because they didn't think to get enough oil. This one here. Interpretations of this parable vary widely. The ending judgment part is once again hard for us to hear or to understand. I continue, as I mentioned in the last few weeks, to cling to the belief that there are second and third and fourth chances to live our faith following in Jesus's way if we don't get it right the first time. The idea of a harsh judgment for those who hear Jesus's words but still ignore them makes me understand a little bit better the Roman Catholic idea of purgatory. Let's bear in mind, though, that Jesus was at the end of his ministry when he told these stories. Time was short. This was a story he told that very week that he was arrested. His message about the way to live had little time left for him to teach before he would be leaving them. Maybe he felt an incredibly urgent need to convince others of the right way. Or, as some commentators suggest, maybe the harsh judgment was an addition made by the gospel writer, Matthew, for his own community's benefit. Maybe he was having a hard time getting them to follow Jesus's way. So we're going to leave that question for another day. I like leaving those hard questions for another day. Let's focus on the message that Jesus had for his followers in this parable. First, what about the talent? You notice I changed where it said coin to talent. I hadn't realized the translation that I had chosen used the word coin. Talent is much better for what I wanted to talk about. It's the actual word that Jesus used. It was an extraordinary amount of money. It was enormous, an enormous amount of money. 1 talent was equal to the amount of money a day laborer might expect to make in 20 years of working. Just 1 talent. The master, the stand-in for Jesus or God, take your pick, is leaving, and he's telling them he doesn't know when he's going to return. He's unsure when he's going to return. And he gives this huge amount of money to his servants. In other translations, they're actually called slaves. Servants, slaves, either way, would probably have had no money or very little money of their own. This was an unbelievable gift to them to hand that over. Now, he gives them the talents with no instructions on how to use it. He doesn't tell them at all what they should do with this gift. Well, he's gone. In the master's leaving, this is what we can understand. We understand God's desire for us to grow, to live creatively, and to live lives abundantly in those things that please God. Love, mercy, service, generosity, relationship building, reconciliation, all those things. And if we think of talents as gifts that we have been given by God to work for shalom, it's easier to understand this parable, I think. If you know the poet Mary Oliver, I'm sure many of you do, she asks at the end of one of her most famous poems, "Tell me, what is it that you are going to do with your one wild and precious life?" It seems to me that that is the core question that Jesus is asking in this parable. Are you going to hide? Am I going to hide our God-given gifts, our talents, burying them in the ground? As he put it in another part of the Gospel of Matthew, hiding them under a bushel basket? Or are we going to take what God has gifted us with and use it to our best ability? Now, the third slave was motivated by fear, because he imagined that the master was a harsh, brutal man. Something I realized once really resonates with this particular passage. I don't know if I realized it or if I read it. It's all the same, I guess. But it's that too many Christians follow an Old Testament God. Too many Christians of the New Testament, the new covenant, the new promise that Jesus gave us, follow an Old Testament God. Those are the people who say they follow Jesus, the healer, the reconciler, but they quote the Pharisee, the laws of Leviticus, and the actions and words of a sometimes violent seeming God in the Old Testament. You know the stories. They're there. The smiting, the retribution, even genocide when you think about the Canaanites, and war. There's much in the Old Testament about God punishing Israel through having war come, armies come, and wipe them out, or almost wipe them out. And there's remnants of that thinking in the end times scriptures of Jesus, like this one, when Jesus speaks about being thrown into the dark. It's no wonder that the third slave or servant buried the talent in the ground. By the way, our English word for talent, or the English word talent, comes from this very parable. At stewardship time, we pledge our time, our talent, and our treasure. And the talent refers to our gifts, the gifts that we can offer the church in order for it to grow and deepen and thrive. In order for the church, which remember is us, we certainly know now that we're not in a building, that the church is not a building. The talent, time, and treasure, the talent part is the gifts that we have and can offer the world and offer the church in order for the world to grow and deepen and thrive. In order for the church to change the world into the world that God intends for us. Now that is risky and brave and bold. The church that doesn't reach out to others to share its talents is a church that's not doing the work of the words used in this parable, the work of the master. So I think this is a good thing to ponder during the interim time that we're experiencing right now. How is Pilgrim Church using its talents, its gifts? Is it being overly prudent in keeping what it has buried safe? How can the church accept the invitation to the adventure of faith, as one commentator puts it, into the high-risk venture of being a disciple following Jesus? So finally, I want to quote two commentators. The first one is John M. Buchanan, and he wrote this in a commentary called Feasting on the Faith. No, it's not. It's called Feasting on the Word. I always confuse that. Jesus' warning, he writes, is that the outcome of playing it safe, of not caring, not loving passionately, not investing yourself, not risking anything, is something akin to death, to being buried, like being banished to outer darkness. And for most of us, our faith isn't a high-risk adventure. Faith has seemed to be a personal comfort zone for some of us. Faith, we think, is no more risky than believing ideas in our heads about Jesus, about God, about a list of beliefs to which we more or less subscribe intellectually. Faith, we think, sometimes is getting our own personal theology right and then living a good life by avoiding bad things. For these people, those people, maybe us, religion is a pretty timid, non-risky adventure, he writes. I already told you about Chester, the man from the church that I told you about at the beginning of the sermon, the one who had the suggestion of giving the $200 for each of us to grow in creative ways. The same man who balked at the idea that Jesus might be countercultural. And yet, he had this wonderful, out-of-the-box idea, risky idea of how to use Mrs. Harrell's gift to the church, instead of keeping it safe in investments with good interest. Another very wise commentator, Father John Shea, writes this: When humans receive the divine spirit, which is a theological term for talents in this parable, when they receive the divine spirit into their human spirit, they are encouraged to cooperate with God to give it away. What has been freely received is freely given. And as soon as this happens, the human is conscious of more spirit. When spirit is given away, it doubles, triples, quadruples. And this is a process of spiritual enjoyment, which this parable calls entering into the joy of the master. Jesus instructs us on the right way to use the Holy Spirit that God gives us like a daily shower of grace. How are we going to use it is what Jesus asks. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my mind and my heart be acceptable to God. Amen.